Look, I'm just a regular guy who works for the state water department and wanted to save some money on our water bill. My wife and I have two kids, a mortgage, and like everyone else, we're trying to make ends meet. So, when I set up some rain barrels in our backyard to collect water for the garden, I figured I was being responsible. What I didn't expect was our HOA president Karen telling me it looked trashy and demanding I get rid of it. 8 months later, when her water bill hit over $300 and she was calling me crying for help, I realized sometimes being prepared isn't about being paranoid. It's just about paying attention to what's coming. But wait until you hear what happened when Karen discovered that the ugly water conservation system she'd spent months trying to eliminate was connected to a much bigger problem, and that her fight against my rain barrels had accidentally exposed her own scheme to inflate community water costs for personal profit. What would you do if someone tried to stop you from saving money on basic utilities? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I bet your family's dealing with rising water costs too. If you love seeing justice served when people learn that practical common sense beats aesthetic obsession, hit that subscribe button for more stories where being prepared pays off. Picture this. It's a typical Tuesday morning in Oakwood Hills, California, and I'm checking my rain barrel system before heading to work at the California Department of Water Resources. The smell of eucalyptus trees fills the air as I inspect the gutters, downspouts, and collection tanks that have saved my family hundreds of dollars on water bills over the past 2 years. I'm David Chen, 41 years old, and I work as a water management engineer for the state. My wife Lisa runs a small accounting practice from home, and we have two kids, Emma, 14, and Jake, 12. We're just regular folks trying to make it work in California, where everything costs more every year, and water bills have tripled since we moved here 5 years ago. The rain collection system in our backyard isn't anything fancy, just 655-gallon barrels connected to our gutters with basic PVC piping. During California's rainy season, these barrels collect about 800 gallons of water that we use for our vegetable garden, fruit trees, and landscape irrigation. It's saved us roughly $150 per month on water costs, which makes a real difference for a family budget. This morning's inspection showed exactly what I hoped to see: full barrels from the previous week's rain and a system running smoothly without leaks or overflow issues. We were ready for another month of California's increasingly expensive water prices. That peaceful morning routine was shattered by the aggressive sound of heels clicking across our patio and a voice that carried the particular authority of someone who'd clearly been building up to a confrontation for weeks. "David!" Karen Davis called out as she marched toward my rain barrels carrying a folder and wearing the kind of determined expression that meant someone was about to have their day ruined. "We need to discuss your water hoarding situation." Karen Davis was 45 years old, a real estate agent who'd moved to California from Phoenix 3 years ago. She drove a white Lexus SUV that was always spotless, lived in the biggest house in our neighborhood, and had somehow gotten herself elected HOA president, despite understanding absolutely nothing about California water management or drought conditions. "Morning, Karen," I replied, setting down my wrench and preparing for what I figured would be another complaint about something completely reasonable that she'd decided was a problem. "I've been getting complaints from neighbors," Karen announced, opening her folder with the satisfaction of someone who'd been collecting evidence. "Your water hoarding installation is creating an eyesore that's affecting property values, and several residents are concerned about mosquito breeding and safety hazards." I looked at her for a moment, trying to process the phrase water hoarding being applied to basic rainwater collection during the worst drought in California history. We were living in a state where water conservation was legally required, where lawn watering was restricted to specific days, and where residents were encouraged to reduce consumption by any means possible. "Karen, these are rain barrels for water conservation. They collect rainwater for irrigation, so we don't have to use treated municipal water for our garden. It's actually exactly what the state recommends during drought conditions." "That's the problem," Karen shot back, warming to her prepared argument. "When residents start installing industrial water storage, it makes the neighborhood look like we're in some kind of crisis situation. This is a premium residential community, not a survival compound." The conversation was already surreal. Karen was calling basic water conservation industrial storage and complaining that drought preparedness made our neighborhood look like we were in crisis, while we were literally in the middle of a state-declared drought emergency. Besides, Karen continued, clearly building toward her main point, I've researched the regulations, and residential water collection requires permits and safety inspections that you don't have. You're operating illegal water storage in violation of county health codes. This was interesting. Karen was making claims about water collection regulations that I knew were wrong because water law and drought management were literally my job. California has some of the most permissive rainwater collection laws in the country, specifically because of our ongoing water crisis. Karen, residential rainwater collection under 5,000 gallons doesn't require permits in California. The state actually encourages it through rebate programs and conservation incentives. Well, that's not what I was told, Karen replied, though her tone suggested less confidence than before. And regardless of permits, the HOA has standards about residential appearance that your industrial equipment clearly violates. Did you speak with someone at the county water department who specifically handles rainwater collection, or did you talk to general staff who might not be familiar with conservation regulations? Karen's pause suggested she'd done exactly what I suspected, called random county offices without talking to anyone who actually understood water policy. The main issue, she continued, avoiding my question about her research, is that your water hoarding creates unfair advantages that affect community water pressure and availability. When some residents start stockpiling water, it puts extra strain on municipal systems that everyone else depends on. This statement was so wrong, it was almost educational. Rainwater collection actually reduces strain on municipal systems by decreasing demand for treated water. It's literally the opposite of what Karen was claiming. Karen, collecting rainwater reduces demand on municipal systems. It means less treated water usage, which helps everyone's water pressure and reduces costs for the entire community. That sounds like engineering theory, Karen dismissed, but the practical reality is that your storage tanks make neighbors feel like they need to compete for water resources. It creates anxiety about water availability that affects everyone's quality of life. I realized that Karen's opposition wasn't based on regulations or community impact. It was based on her fundamental discomfort with visible reminders that resources weren't unlimited. She wanted to maintain the illusion that California water was abundant and that conservation measures were unnecessary. Besides, Karen added, clearly preparing her closing argument, premium residential communities should rely on professional landscaping and municipal water systems, not individual survival preparations that make neighborhoods look unstable. Karen had made her position clear. She opposed water conservation because it looked like preparation for problems she didn't want to acknowledge. She wanted me to remove systems that saved money and conserved resources because they reminded her that California was experiencing serious drought conditions. I made a decision that would prove crucial in everything that followed. Karen, I understand your aesthetic concerns, but I'm not removing water conservation systems that save my family money and help during drought conditions. If you want to file HOA complaints or county reports, that's your choice. But I'm not eliminating practical preparations for financial reasons. Karen's expression shifted from confident authority to genuine irritation. Fine, but don't expect neighborhood support when your survival prepper installations start affecting everyone else's property values. And don't come asking for community help when your water hoarding creates problems for municipal systems. She marched back toward her house with that stiff-backed walk that suggested I'd just made a serious enemy over what she considered selfish resource stockpiling. That evening, over dinner with Lisa and the kids, I explained Karen's visit and what it might mean for our family's relationship with the HOA. Dad, are we really hoarding water? Emma asked, having overheard enough of Karen's complaints to be concerned about our family's conservation efforts. Lisa, who'd been tracking our household budget and knew exactly how much the rain barrels saved us monthly, answered with the practical certainty that had made me fall in love with her 16 years earlier. Emma, Jake, your father's rain barrels save our family about $150 every month on water costs. That's money we can use for things like your soccer registration and music lessons instead of paying the city for water that falls on our roof for free. But Mrs. Davis says we're making the neighborhood look bad, Jake added, having apparently heard Karen's aesthetic complaints during one of her property inspection walks. Mrs. Davis moved here from Arizona, where water's much cheaper and drought isn't a constant concern, I explained. She doesn't understand that in California, water conservation isn't about looking bad. It's about being smart with resources and saving money. The conversation reminded me why I'd installed rain collection in the first place. This wasn't about preparing for apocalypse scenarios. It was about practical money management during a time when basic utilities were becoming increasingly expensive for working families. Over the following weeks, Karen's campaign against my water conservation escalated with the systematic determination of someone who'd decided that eliminating visible drought preparations was essential to maintaining community property values. She organized what she called aesthetic standards meetings at her house, where she presented research about property values, municipal water reliability, and the psychological effects of crisis mentality on neighborhood stability. I wasn't invited to these meetings, but several neighbors mentioned that Karen was building support for HOA restrictions on individual water storage. She began distributing flyers throughout the neighborhood, explaining why residential water collection was unnecessary and potentially harmful to community water systems. The flyers included selected quotes from municipal studies, carefully edited to support her argument that individual conservation could actually increase water costs for other residents. Most concerning, Karen started contacting my kids' friends' parents, expressing concerns about the anxiety that our drought preparations might be causing neighborhood children. She apparently believed that visible water conservation made kids unnecessarily worried about resource scarcity. But Karen's most serious escalation came when she filed formal complaints with the county planning office and the state water department, claiming that our rain collection violated multiple health codes and water management regulations. I received official notices requiring me to appear at county planning meetings to address complaints about unpermitted water storage and non-compliance with municipal water systems. Karen had forced me to defend basic water conservation through official bureaucratic channels. The planning meeting was scheduled for a Thursday afternoon in the county government building. I took time off work to attend, bringing documentation showing that our rain collection system met all state conservation guidelines and actually supported municipal water management goals. Karen arrived at the meeting with printed research and what appeared to be prepared statements about the dangers of residential water storage. She'd clearly invested significant time in building her case against water conservation. The meeting was chaired by Tom Martinez, the county water conservation coordinator, who I knew professionally through my state water department work. Tom had been dealing with California drought management for over 20 years, and he understood water conservation better than most municipal officials. Mrs. B. Davis, Tom began, you filed complaints about residential rainwater collection by your neighbor, Mr. Chen. Can you explain your specific concerns about regulatory compliance? Karen launched into a detailed presentation about how individual water storage could disrupt municipal water pressure, create health hazards from stagnant water, and violate community standards for residential appearance and safety. Her research was thorough, but it was based on fundamental misunderstandings about California water law and the difference between large-scale water storage and basic residential conservation. She'd found legitimate concerns about improperly maintained water systems, but she'd applied those concerns to conservation practices that were specifically encouraged by state policy. When Karen finished her presentation, Tom turned to me with the professional courtesy that one water management professional extends to another. David, you want to respond to these concerns? I presented my state water department credentials, conservation system documentation, and data showing that our rain collection reduced municipal water demand while meeting all state safety and conservation guidelines. The system included overflow management, mosquito prevention, and maintenance protocols that exceeded recommended standards. More importantly, I had documentation from the California Department of Water Resources showing that residential rainwater collection was explicitly encouraged under current drought management policies and that our system represented exactly the kind of individual conservation that helped communities manage water scarcity. Tom, I concluded, Mrs. Davis raises valid concerns about improperly maintained water storage, but our rain collection system meets state conservation standards and actually supports community water management goals rather than undermining them. Tom reviewed my documentation with the expertise of someone who dealt with water conservation issues daily. Mrs. Davis, he said finally, Mr. Chen's rainwater collection appears to meet state conservation guidelines and county safety requirements. Residential water conservation is explicitly encouraged under current drought management policies. Karen's face showed several emotions as she realized her regulatory challenge had failed. But what about community aesthetics and property values? She pressed. What about the psychological impact of making neighbors feel like they're living in crisis conditions? Ma'am, county regulations don't restrict water conservation based on aesthetic preferences. If Mr. Chen's system meets safety and conservation requirements, community appearance concerns are outside our regulatory authority. The meeting ended with Karen's complaints dismissed and my water conservation officially validated by County Water Management Review. But I knew this wouldn't be the end of Karen's campaign against what she saw as unnecessary crisis preparations. Over the following month, Karen's efforts intensified as California drought conditions worsened and water restrictions became more severe throughout our region. She organized a neighborhood petition claiming that individual water storage created unfair resource distribution and requesting voluntary removal of conservation systems for community equity. The petition gained some signatures from neighbors who'd been convinced by Karen's arguments about municipal water reliability. She contacted local landscaping companies, asking them to assess whether residential water collection interfered with professional irrigation and municipal water pressure. Several companies, apparently influenced by Karen's presentation about competing water systems, suggested that individual conservation might complicate their commercial landscaping services. Most troubling, Karen began spreading rumors that residential water collection could void homeowners insurance due to unauthorized water storage, and that families with rain barrels might face liability issues if neighborhood water pressure problems developed. But what I didn't know was that Karen's campaign against water conservation was connected to a much more serious problem that would soon expose her real motivations for opposing individual resource management. During this same period, I'd been noticing irregularities in neighborhood water billing that didn't match normal usage patterns. Several neighbors mentioned unusually high water costs, and the municipal billing seemed inconsistent with actual consumption data. As a state water management engineer, I had access to regional consumption databases that showed water usage patterns throughout California communities. When I ran analysis on our neighborhood's billing versus actual consumption, the numbers didn't add up. Our community was being billed for significantly more water than municipal records showed we were receiving. Someone was inflating water costs and pocketing the difference, a scheme that could only work if residents weren't paying attention to conservation or tracking their actual usage. The person running this billing fraud needed neighbors who weren't monitoring water costs, who weren't implementing conservation measures, and who weren't questioning unusually high utility bills. Karen's campaign against water conservation wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about maintaining the conditions that allowed her billing manipulation to continue undetected. That's when the drought hit with full force, and Karen's world started falling apart in ways she never saw coming. The severe drought that struck California in early summer created water restrictions that exposed both Karen's billing fraud and the critical importance of the conservation systems she'd been trying to eliminate. Municipal water restrictions limited residential usage to 50 gallons per day per household, with severe financial penalties for exceeding allocation. Landscaping water was restricted to once per week, and recreational water use was completely prohibited. For families with water conservation systems, these restrictions were manageable. Our rain barrels provided irrigation water that didn't count toward municipal allocation, and our drought-resistant landscaping required minimal supplemental watering. Karen's water bills skyrocketed to over $300 per month as she exceeded allocation trying to maintain her lawn and garden. Her landscaping began dying despite expensive irrigation, and her monthly utility costs jumped to levels that strained even her real estate agent income. More importantly, the drought exposed Karen's billing manipulation scheme when municipal water auditors began investigating consumption discrepancies throughout our region. State water investigators discovered that Karen had been inflating neighborhood water bills by reporting false consumption data to municipal billing systems and pocketing the difference through shell companies she controlled. The scheme had been generating nearly $50,000 annually in fraudulent billing throughout our community. The investigation revealed that Karen's opposition to water conservation wasn't about aesthetics or community standards. It was about preventing residents from tracking their actual water usage and discovering her billing fraud. When families monitor water consumption through conservation measures, they notice discrepancies between actual usage and municipal billing. Karen's fraud could only continue if neighbors remained unaware of their real water costs and consumption patterns. The first sign that Karen's world was collapsing came on a Tuesday morning when I found her standing at my front door at 7 a.m., looking genuinely panicked for the first time since I'd known her. "David," she said, her voice lacking the confident authority I'd grown accustomed to hearing, "I need to ask you about something. My water bills. They're completely out of control." I looked at her standing there with papers in her hand, papers that I suspected were water bills she could no longer afford, and investigation notices she couldn't ignore. "What kind of problems are you seeing, Karen?" "My bill hit $347 last month, and this month they're saying I owe over $400, she said, her words coming quickly as if she was still processing the financial reality. "The city's threatening to shut off service if I don't pay, but I can't afford these amounts. I don't understand how water can cost this much." I could see the weight of multiple crises converging in her expression, the realization that her water bills were unaffordable, that her landscaping was dying despite expensive irrigation, and that the conservation systems she'd opposed were the only thing keeping other families from facing similar disaster. "How much water are you actually using per month?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would reveal the full scope of her problems. "I don't know," Karen replied. "I never tracked usage before. I just paid whatever the bills said I owed. But now, with the drought restrictions and these massive costs, I can't keep up with payments." This was the moment when 8 months of opposing water conservation collided with the reality of California drought economics and Karen's own billing fraud being investigated by state authorities. "Karen," I said gently, "I think we need to look at your actual water usage versus what you're being billed and figure out how to implement conservation measures that can reduce your costs." What we discovered during that review was a family crisis created by both drought conditions and Karen's own fraudulent billing practices coming back to destroy her finances. Karen's municipal water bills showed consumption levels that were physically impossible for a single household, evidence of the billing manipulation that was now being investigated by state water fraud investigators. She'd been inflating her own bills along with everyone else's, but she'd also been spending the fraudulent proceeds on maintaining unsustainable landscaping that required massive water usage. When drought restrictions limited municipal water access, Karen couldn't maintain her water-intensive landscaping without exceeding allocation limits that triggered severe financial penalties. Her monthly water costs had tripled just as state investigators were demanding repayment of fraudulent billing proceeds. Most critically, Karen had no water conservation infrastructure to help manage drought conditions, because she'd spent months opposing exactly the systems that would have saved her family hundreds of dollars monthly. "I don't understand how this happened," Karen said, as we reviewed her billing and usage data. "I was trying to maintain community standards and prevent crisis mentality, but now I'm the one facing financial crisis from water costs." "Karen, the conservation systems you opposed weren't about crisis mentality. They were about practical preparation for exactly the conditions we're facing now. Drought isn't a crisis you can prevent through positive thinking. It's a resource challenge you manage through conservation and preparation." Over the following weeks, as Karen's legal troubles intensified and her financial situation deteriorated, she began to understand the connections between resource conservation, financial planning, and community resilience during challenging conditions. The state water fraud investigation resulted in criminal charges against Karen for billing manipulation, restitution requirements exceeding $75,000, and immediate termination from her HOA position. Her real estate license was suspended pending resolution of fraud charges. But perhaps most importantly for our neighborhood, Karen's legal troubles led to comprehensive water billing audits that corrected fraudulent charges and reduced water costs for every family in our community. The corrected billing, combined with drought management policies that encourage conservation, created financial incentives for residents to implement exactly the water collection and conservation systems that Karen had spent months opposing. 6 months after her arrest, Karen contacted me requesting help with installing rain collection and drought management systems for her property. The financial necessity of water conservation had overcome her aesthetic objections to visible conservation infrastructure. "David," she said, during our conversation about installing water collection at her house. I want you to know that I was completely wrong about water conservation and its importance for family financial security. I didn't understand that resource management isn't about crisis mentality. It's about practical preparation for predictable challenges. The installation of Karen's water conservation system became a neighborhood education opportunity, demonstrating how rainwater collection, drought-resistant landscaping, and usage monitoring could reduce water costs while supporting municipal conservation goals. But perhaps the most meaningful change came when Karen began advocating for water conservation education and community resource management throughout our region. I learned through financial crisis and legal consequences. Karen would tell audiences of homeowners and HOA boards that opposing practical conservation, because it looks like crisis preparation, can create actual crisis when resource challenges arrive. Water conservation isn't about fear. It's about responsible financial management and community resilience. Today, our neighborhood has become a model for suburban water conservation and drought management in California. Most homes have some form of rainwater collection, and the Community Association provides education about conservation techniques and financial benefits of resource management. Karen Davis serves as a volunteer coordinator for the Oakwood Hills Water Conservation Project, working with county extension offices and state water departments to help families implement conservation systems and avoid the financial crisis she experienced. The transformation has been remarkable. From a community that opposed water conservation as unnecessary crisis preparation to a neighborhood that's become a regional example of how suburban residents can achieve water security while reducing utility costs. But the long-term impact of Karen's fraud case and our neighborhood's transformation extended far beyond Oakwood Hills. The investigation led to statewide policy changes regarding utility billing, oversight, and community water conservation support. The California Public Utilities Commission used our case as the foundation for the Water Billing Transparency Act, legislation that required independent auditing of municipal water billing and created protection mechanisms for communities targeted by utility fraud schemes. I was invited to testify before the California legislature during consideration of the Water Billing Transparency Act, representing families who had discovered billing fraud through conservation, monitoring, and resource tracking. Karen's fraud scheme succeeded for 2 years because residents weren't monitoring their actual water usage, I told the legislative committee. When families implement conservation systems, they become naturally aware of consumption patterns that make billing fraud detectable. Water conservation isn't just about drought management, it's about financial protection for residential communities. The legislation passed with bipartisan support and became a model for similar laws in other drought-prone states throughout the Southwest. Federal water management agencies began promoting residential conservation, monitoring as essential infrastructure for both resource management and fraud prevention. Karen's transformation during this period became equally comprehensive. While serving her community service sentence for utility fraud, she completed certification as a water conservation specialist through the state extension program. I have unique credibility when I talk to communities about the importance of resource monitoring, Karen explained during one of her educational presentations. I can honestly say that I was wrong about conservation being unnecessary, and I can show exactly how opposing practical resource management can create the conditions that allow fraud and financial crisis to develop. Her presentations included detailed case studies of our neighborhood's billing fraud, showing how conservation monitoring had exposed the scheme and protected families from continued financial exploitation. The before and after financial analysis provided compelling evidence that resource conservation created economic benefits beyond simple utility savings. Karen also worked with law enforcement agencies throughout California to develop fraud prevention education programs, helping communities recognize billing irregularities and implement monitoring systems that could detect utility fraud before it caused serious financial damage. 3 years after her conviction, Karen completed her community service requirements and began working as a paid consultant for water conservation education programs throughout the Southwest. Her personal experience with both fraud and financial crisis made her an effective advocate for practical resource management. My billing fraud cost families in our community over $160,000 in false charges, Karen would tell audiences of municipal officials, and community leaders. But the conservation systems I opposed would have exposed my scheme within months if residents had been monitoring their usage. Communities that implement conservation education protect themselves from both resource scarcity and financial fraud. 5 years after the drought and fraud investigation, Oakwood Hills hosted the first annual California Community Water Security Conference, bringing together water management professionals, conservation educators, and community advocates from throughout the state. The conference featured presentations on residential conservation technology, billing fraud prevention, and community resilience during drought conditions. But the most powerful sessions came from families who had experienced both resource challenges and financial fraud, providing first-hand accounts of how conservation and monitoring could protect communities from multiple threats. Emma and Jake, now 18 and 16, participated in the conference as youth advocates for resource education and financial literacy. Their presentation, titled Growing Up Conservation-Minded: How Resource Awareness Shapes Community Responsibility, addressed the educational benefits that children experience when families prioritize practical resource management. Living through our neighborhood's drought and fraud crisis taught us that resource conservation isn't about restriction or fear, Emma told the conference audience. It's about understanding how systems work, so families can make informed decisions that protect both environmental resources and financial security. Jake added, when communities monitor their resource usage and understand their actual costs, they become resistant to both environmental challenges and economic exploitation. Conservation education creates informed citizens who can protect themselves and their neighbors from multiple threats. The conference concluded with the announcement of the California Community Resilience Research Institute, a joint project between the State Water Department, University of California, Extension Services, and community conservation organizations. The institute would develop improved conservation technologies while documenting best practices for community-wide resource management and fraud prevention. I was appointed as the institute's founding research director, a position that allowed me to expand community conservation research beyond California to drought-prone regions throughout the western United States. The Institute's first major project involved documenting community resilience during the Oakwood Hills drought and fraud crisis, plus similar challenges in other residential areas that had experienced both resource scarcity and financial exploitation. The research confirmed that conservation education could improve community resilience by 60 to 75% compared to areas that relied solely on municipal systems without resident monitoring. More importantly, the research demonstrated that communities with active conservation programs showed significantly lower rates of utility fraud, environmental degradation, and economic vulnerability during resource challenges. The Institute also developed standardized guidelines for residential conservation systems, making effective resource management more accessible to families without advanced technical knowledge. The guidelines included detailed specifications for different climate regions, conservation technologies, and community coordination systems. But perhaps the most significant research finding involved the educational and community benefits of conservation awareness. Families with conservation systems showed increased understanding of resource cycles, greater community engagement during challenges, and improved financial literacy regarding utility costs and resource management. Today, 8 years after Karen's fraud conviction and our drought crisis, over 70% of California's suburban communities have some form of resident-supported conservation program. Property values in conservation-conscious neighborhoods significantly exceed values in areas that rely solely on municipal systems without resident involvement. The transformation has been so comprehensive that new residents moving to California communities routinely ask about conservation programs and resource education opportunities during home purchasing decisions. Real estate agents now market community conservation infrastructure as premium features that provide both environmental benefits and financial protection. Emma and Jake, now working as environmental consultants specializing in community resource management, credit their experience with our neighborhood's crisis for shaping their professional dedication to conservation education and community resilience. Growing up during drought and fraud taught us that resource challenges and financial threats often occur simultaneously. Emma explained during a recent interview about her work developing community conservation programs. Conservation education helps communities prepare for both environmental and economic challenges rather than addressing them separately. Jake, who specializes in residential conservation technology and fraud prevention systems, added, "Our neighborhood's experience showed that practical resource management and financial protection aren't separate concerns. They're integrated approaches to community resilience that protect families from multiple threats." Karen Davis, now 53 and recognized as one of California's leading water conservation educators, frequently speaks about the connections between resource management, financial security, and community fraud prevention. "I learned through personal crisis and legal consequences that opposing practical conservation creates vulnerability to both environmental challenges and economic exploitation," she tells audiences of community leaders, municipal officials, and conservation advocates. Resource education isn't about fear or restriction. It's about creating informed communities that can protect themselves from predictable threats. Her presentations always include the fundamental lesson that our neighborhood's crisis taught everyone involved. Resource conservation and financial monitoring aren't separate activities. They're complementary approaches to community security that protect families from both environmental challenges and economic fraud that often target the same vulnerable populations. But the most profound impact has been on how California approaches community resilience education and resource security planning. The Oakwood Hills case study is now required curriculum in municipal management programs throughout the state, teaching future city planners and community leaders about the connections between conservation education, fraud prevention, and economic security. The California Department of Water Resources has established the Community Resource Resilience Initiative, a $50 million program that provides funding and technical assistance for residential conservation programs, billing monitoring systems, and community education projects throughout the state. I've been serving as the initiative's technical advisor, helping communities implement conservation programs that provide both environmental benefits and economic protection from utility fraud and resource scarcity. The initiative has supported over 300 communities in developing integrated conservation and monitoring programs, with documented results showing average household savings of $180 monthly on utility costs, plus protection from billing fraud schemes that had been targeting communities without active resource monitoring. More importantly, communities participating in the initiative show significantly higher levels of civic engagement, community cooperation, and economic resilience during both environmental challenges and economic downturns. Lisa, who has been working as a financial consultant specializing in household resource budgeting, credits our family's experience with conservation for shaping her understanding of how resource management affects family financial security. "David's rain barrels didn't just save us money on water bills," she explains to families seeking financial counseling. "They taught our entire family that resource awareness and financial planning are connected skills that create economic security rather than separate concerns that compete for attention." Lisa's practice now specializes in helping families implement resource conservation as part of comprehensive financial planning, showing clients how conservation investments provide both environmental benefits and economic protection that traditional financial instruments can't offer. The long-term economic data from our neighborhood supports Lisa's approach. Families who implemented conservation systems before the drought and fraud crisis showed 40% less financial stress during resource shortages, 60% lower utility costs during crisis periods, and significantly higher long-term savings rates compared to families who relied solely on traditional financial planning without resource consideration. Emma and Jake have taken their childhood experience with conservation education and applied it to their adult careers in ways that continue expanding the impact of resource awareness throughout California and beyond. Emma's environmental consulting firm specializes in helping communities develop conservation education and programs that integrate environmental stewardship with economic security and fraud prevention. Her work has influenced resource management policy in 12 states and 3 Canadian provinces. "Our childhood experience with drought and fraud taught me that environmental challenges and economic threats often target the same vulnerable populations," Emma says. Effective conservation education must address both environmental resilience and economic protection to create truly sustainable communities. Jake's technology company develops software systems that help communities monitor resource usage and detect billing irregularities before they become major fraud schemes. His monitoring systems are now used by over 500 communities throughout the western United States. The billing fraud that targeted our neighborhood succeeded because residents weren't monitoring their actual resource usage, Jake explains. Technology can make resource monitoring as simple as checking your bank account, giving families the information they need to protect themselves from both environmental challenges and economic fraud. The software Jake developed provides real-time usage monitoring, billing verification, and conservation optimization that helps families reduce resource costs while detecting potential fraud before it creates serious financial damage. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of our family's approach to conservation came 5 years ago when the California Governor's Office recognized Oakwood Hills as the state's model community for integrated resource management and economic resilience. Governor Williams visited our neighborhood during the recognition ceremony, touring conservation installations and meeting with families who had benefited from both environmental stewardship and fraud prevention programs. What happened in Oakwood Hills represents the future of community resilience, Governor Williams said during her visit. When residents understand resource management and monitor their consumption, they create communities that are resistant to both environmental challenges and economic exploitation. This is how California communities can thrive during uncertain times. The governor's recognition led to increased state funding for community conservation programs and federal attention to California's integrated approach to resource management and fraud prevention. Our neighborhood has hosted delegations from municipal leaders throughout the United States and internationally, with visitors studying how conservation education can create both environmental benefits and economic protection for residential communities. The most frequent question from visiting delegations involves the connection between conservation awareness and fraud prevention. Many communities struggle with utility fraud, but hadn't considered how conservation education could provide protection from economic exploitation. Conservation monitoring gives residents the information they need to verify billing accuracy, I explained to visiting officials. When families understand their actual resource usage, they become naturally resistant to billing fraud and other forms of utility exploitation. The international attention has led to collaboration with communities in Australia, Canada, and the European Union that face similar challenges with resource scarcity and utility fraud targeting residential areas. Our neighborhood's transformation from opposing conservation as unnecessary to becoming a global model for resource resilience demonstrates that practical education and community cooperation can address multiple challenges simultaneously, rather than requiring separate solutions for environmental and economic threats. Today, when Lisa and I talk to young families about choosing homes and building financial security, we always emphasize the connections between resource awareness, environmental stewardship, and economic protection. Water conservation saved our family thousands of dollars in utility costs, I tell them. But more importantly, it taught us that practical preparation and financial responsibility work together to create security that no single approach can provide. The rain barrels that Karen once called ugly have become valued community infrastructure that provides both environmental benefits and economic protection for families throughout California and beyond. Sometimes being prepared really isn't about being paranoid. It's just about paying attention to what's coming and taking practical steps that protect your family from predictable challenges. What resource management challenges is your family facing? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience could help other families understand how practical conservation can provide both environmental benefits and economic protection. If this video opened your eyes to connections between resource awareness and financial security, remember that conservation education benefits entire communities rather than just individual households. And if you love seeing justice served when people learn that practical common sense beats aesthetic obsession, hit that subscribe button for more stories where preparation and responsibility create better outcomes than ignoring predictable challenges. Emma and Jake, now 16 and 14, have grown up understanding that resource conservation isn't about expecting disaster. It's about practical management of family finances and environmental responsibility. They've seen firsthand how preparation and conservation can protect families from economic hardship during resource challenges. When Emma studies environmental science at school and learns about climate adaptation, she knows that our rain barrels represent practical problem solving rather than anxiety about the future. When Jake sees news about drought and water shortages in other regions, he understands that conservation and preparation help communities thrive during challenging conditions. And when Lisa and I talk to other families about managing household costs and preparing for California's ongoing drought challenges, we tell them about our experience in Oakwood Hills. Not the neighborhood that initially opposed water conservation as ugly, but the community that learned to celebrate practical resource management and financial responsibility through direct experience with drought conditions and utility costs. The state water investigation taught us that resource conservation and community transparency aren't about fear or crisis mentality. They're about creating financial stability and community resilience that protects families from both environmental challenges and economic fraud. More importantly, Karen's transformation demonstrated that practical preparation and aesthetic concerns aren't opposites. They're complementary approaches to creating neighborhoods that are both beautiful and financially sustainable during resource challenges. Water conservation exists to help families manage utility costs and resource availability during predictable drought conditions, rather than creating anxiety about future problems. The rain collection systems that Karen once opposed as ugly have become valued community infrastructure that saves money while supporting municipal conservation goals. What utility costs are challenging your family budget? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience could help other families understand the financial benefits of resource conservation and practical preparation. If this video opened your eyes to how water conservation protects family finances during drought conditions, remember that practical resource management benefits entire communities rather than just individual households. And if you love seeing justice served when people learn that practical preparation beats aesthetic obsession, hit that subscribe button for more stories where common sense and family responsibility create better outcomes than ignoring predictable challenges. Remember, sometimes standing up to neighborhood tyrants doesn't just save yourself. It saves everyone around you. When good people refuse to be intimidated by fake authority, entire communities can break free from fear. Thanks for watching HOA Revenge Stories, where we prove that every HOA Karen eventually meets their match.